That going? Hello and welcome back to the Warwick F1 show. We are back covering three races this time. We've had the summer break. It has been and gone. But before we look at the races in Zandvoort and Monza, we're going to be looking at the races that we had just before the summer break. Silverstone, Hungary and Belgium. Three races that were very similar in how they went. We saw the resurgence of McLaren going from being that last place team in Bahrain to now competing for podiums up with the Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari. Aston Martin dropping off a little bit. We'll be discussing that, maybe why that has been the case. Ferrari and Mercedes being successful, but not challenging for those wins. And it's been a winscape dominated by Max Verstappen, who obviously won all three of the races that we're going to be discussing today. His teammate struggling a little bit more, Sergio Perez, and we'll be looking at that as well. Obviously, I can't do this on my own, and I never do this on my own. And we're joined once again by Chinmay and Will. How are you guys doing? Obviously, it has been a while for us, maybe not as you're listening to this, but it's been a few weeks since we recorded, and obviously F1 now back after the summer break. But how have you found it?
Yeah, honestly, everything's just been good. All the sports I watch are back up and running, especially Formula One, which I'm happy about. So, yeah, I'm pretty looking forward for hopefully the second half of the season coming up. And yeah, hopefully we've got some good races and some varied results, which maybe we have kind of been lacking a bit too much this season. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's good to be back. It's been a while, but I'm looking forward to the second half of the season. Like Chinmay said, hopefully we'll get some reliability or grid penalties for Red Bull on not such power hungry tracks. So maybe we'll get to somewhere like, I don't know, Mexico. It's a bit harder to overtake in a straight line, and that Ferrari might have the benefit of the straight line speed without the DRS coming past with the Red Bull. So we can hope.
yeah. As we've said, we'll be covering Monza and Zandvoort in their own standalone episodes. But today we're looking at the three races that happened just before the summer break. Those being Hungary, Silverstone, and Belgium, rounding off before the summer break. But the first one of those was the British Grand Prix. Max Verstappen taking that pole did get overtaken by Lando Norris at the start, but eventually managed to get that lead back and drove off into the sunset. The McLarens, the first race of their resurgence, looking on for a double podium until a mistimed safety car cost Oscar Piastri his first podium in F1, but Lando Norris coming back to finish in second place, and Lewis Hamilton, obviously the Brits home race, he managed to finish third, probably the biggest beneficiary of that safety car as well. Jimmy, it wasn't the most interesting of races. I'd probably give it a 5 out of 10, especially maybe you see Lando go ahead, you hear the roar of the crowd, but then obviously Max, as inevitable as he is, goes on to take that victory.
Yeah, I'll probably give a 6 out of 10, considering that some of the races we've had have been absolute stinkers. But this year, but obviously Silverstone, obviously seeing another inevitable Max victory. Yeah, the first opening lap was really good. Watching actually Max struggling to sort of switch on the tires in the first lap or two, and the second corner we always had Oscar Piastri going for the overtake on Max, but after that, it was just going to be, I think it was at lap 4 or lap 5, Verstappen just breezed past Norris, and then that was the end of the race. And the only thing to be honest, I remember, I think it was that Kevin Magnussen's engine set on fire during about halfway through the race, and that's about it, really.
Yeah, it wasn't the most interesting of races. What about you, Will?
Yes, not one that I exactly remember. I think it's probably the biggest letdown for a British Grand Prix in quite a long time, actually, I think, considering you think of the races we've had in the last few years with the mix up on the podiums and everything. It was a bit of a letdown in comparison to those, and but it was a good showing from some teams that hadn't necessarily been doing so well. So even Alex Albon had a good result for Williams as well, beating both Ferraris, who had a bit of a disastrous weekend.
Yeah, and I mean, a team that did come from out of nowhere almost was McLaren. It's like they was the ninth quickest team in Bahrain, and then just about 9 or 10 races later, they're challenging even for the lead right at the start, but definitely for podiums. Realistically, should have got a double podium had the safety car not played into the hands of some drivers over others. But I don't think we've seen a team go from the back or so far near the back to so far near the front so quickly in a season for years now. At least I can't think of an example that is comparable.
No, I think the only one I can really think of is such a long time ago, in like 2009, perhaps when all the regulations were really iffy, and towards the end of the season you had the bigger teams coming back. I suppose the only other one was probably 2017 or 18 when Red Bull started quite poorly but came back later in the season when as Ferrari dropped off.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
nah, I don't think I remember anything other than that, to be honest, either. But yeah,
yeah, and it wasn't just Norris up the front. Obviously, we know Lando Norris is a really good driver. It was Oscar Piastri as well, and we'll come and talk about it in both the later races actually in Hungary and Belgium. But Piastri, in his first season in F1, is a legitimate contender or those 3 races showed he was a legitimate contender for podiums. Maybe not wins at the moment, especially with Verstappen's dominance. But if you say Verstappen isn't there, he's challenging for those top level positions. And if Verstappen isn't there, those top level positions are, in essence, wins.
yeah. I think, especially given the context of how things have gone this season for Red Bull and how dominant they've been, second place is effectively a victory this season. But yeah, it's like seeing now McLaren in the midst of what Mercedes, Aston Martin, either they are starting to fall off. Ferrari, if Ferrari, depending on if they don't mess up, you know, and even at times you got the odd Alpine having the odd show performance as well. But generally, the whole bunch at the front behind Max Verstappen, it's just been so close. It's actually been, if it wasn't for Max just winning and dominating like anything, it, just watching Norris and the fact that because it's so bunched up, Norris has done an excellent job, and with McLaren just bringing those upgrades and just sort of catapulting them towards the front.
Yeah. And I mean, Will, is it fair to say Piastri's performances, they're some of the best we've seen from a rookie driver since maybe, obviously, you look to drivers, you have to obviously compare it with the team they've started in, but you look to maybe Leclerc in that Sauber, even Max Verstappen in the Toro Rosso. They're some of the best performances we've seen from a rookie, at least in the last 4 or 5 years, and it really bodes well for his potential future in McLaren, especially if they can keep performing and maybe even begin to challenge for race wins if obviously Red Bull stop being so dominant.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. His performances, his racecraft, his tidiness, his execution's always been exactly where it needs to be. He's not had, off the top of my head, any silly mistakes, any big crashes that were his fault. He's just been consistent week in, week out, always around or roughly where Norris is, or just slightly behind, or even outperforming him some weeks. I think he's by far the best rookie we've seen in a long time. And he's probably one of the top, probably 5 drivers, in my opinion, on the grid this season, considering he'd had no race experience or no F1 experience before this season.
Yeah, and obviously you mentioned race experience. He didn't race last year as well. He jumped back into the car and has like he's not maybe been beating Norris. I think I was really surprised when I saw I think the stat of the quali head to head. Norris is quite comprehensively beaten Piastri, but you almost think that that shows again how good Norris is as a driver as well and how good Piastri is, and that they like next year it will be a lot closer, and that McLaren team, if they can keep this performance up that they built, they could have a very very strong driver pairing between between the two of them. I mean, where do you think McLaren go from here? Do you think that they just keep going for the rest of the season, sort of trying to compete for those top performances? They're sort of out of sight of the top four teams. They're not going to, unless Alpine somehow miraculously develop, they're not going to be overtaken by Alpine. So do you think that they just consolidate or aim for maybe a potential win if there is that chance? Obviously, with Max Verstappen, it's looking unlikely, but if there is that chance.
I think
Yeah.
there's. Oh, go on,
I know, I was going to say, probably. I mean, it does depend on how the rest of the tracks suit the car as well, because that McLaren does seem to be very draggy at the same time, even though it is, and still doesn't like hot temperatures. So it probably will struggle in places like Mexico and maybe Singapore with the higher temperatures, because that McLaren does seem to eat its tires with tire deck and stuff like that. But it's definitely still got weaknesses that they do need to address. At the end of the day, they don't want to keep focusing on this year and to sort of like hinder development for next year as well. But that shouldn't be too much of an issue considering I don't think there's really any changes to the regulations for next year at the moment. But yeah, I think probably just keep up the rate of upgrading they're doing at the moment.
I think there's a few tracks that come to mind that they'll definitely prosper at for the rest of the season. I think somewhere like Qatar, where it is those medium, lower speed corners, it's quite flowing, similar to Silverstone in a sense without the long straights, basically, where it is a bit harder to overtake, and we saw how well they did there. Somewhere perhaps like Interlagos, similar to Mercedes did last year, where you don't have to have the best power unit to get a good result there. So it'll be interesting to see if they focus on performance of those, or if they go to next year thinking, okay, let's focus on getting a good power unit and giving Red Bull a big test rather than trying to get some points this year when actually they can probably save themselves money for the entry fee next year.
Yeah. And obviously, it really depends on what they decide to do. I think for me, just consolidating. You realistically, unless Aston Martin really do continue to fall off, they're not going to get that top four in the constructors. I think fifth is the place they're going to be, but always keep battling. Start work on that next year's car and just cement the advantage that they've ended up building. Obviously, we've been saying McLaren up the front could be taking those wins if it wasn't for one Dutch driver. And I think it's time to talk about him now. We'll probably talk about him over the three races because they were all fairly similar. It was Max Verstappen. He got a P1 in Silverstone, P1 in Hungary, and a P1 in Belgium. And at this point, there's no, or it doesn't seem like there's any stopping Max from winning everything. Nothing seems to be able to stop him at the moment.
No, definitely not. I mean, if you're winning at Silverstone, Hungary, Spa, and that there seems to be no, other than probably slow tyre warm-ups, that there seems to be no genuinely no weakness to that RB18. That thing is a rocket in the streets, a rocket in all kinds of corners, and it's just the most stable platform you can ever ask for in these generation of cars. And on top of that, you had a driver who's at the peak of his powers right now. There's no stopping him. I genuinely don't think we may see just him winning every single race for the rest of this year. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
I don't think it would surprise anyone if he just kept winning. I think the only thing that could stop him is either a crash with a back marker, maybe Esteban Ocon again will do things that they, or if the car just breaks down. That's probably the only two things that can stop him at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, it just doesn't seem like anything. Like then, it's quite hard to talk about Max Verstappen because there's not like exactly much he does that is noteworthy. That's not to, or maybe not noteworthy, but that is notable. He gets to the front. He does what he needs to do. He drives off and he wins the race. It's incredibly successful. It's quite difficult to talk about. And as I yeah, there seems to be no stopping him. As a recording, he's now taken that record for the most wins or most consecutive wins in an F1 season. Maybe the only comparable like aspect to it, or the only comparison from the past could be a Schumacher in like 2002, 2004. Obviously, the cars now are a lot more bulletproof in terms of reliability, so there isn't like those issues that could potentially scupper like a long race streak. But again, it just there seems to be no way to stop Verstappen, or at least the Verstappen and the red RB19 combination, which will probably go down in history as the most dominant driver car combination that we have seen or we will ever see.
I think as well, the one thing that doesn't get talked about probably quite enough is almost a maturity that we see from him this season that we haven't seen in previous seasons, where he would just put his foot down, burn out the tyres, and just say, "Look, we'll do another pit stop and it'll be fine." He's just sitting at 10, 15 seconds ahead, managing the tyres consistently, managing fuel, not putting the car at risk that he needs to take penalties later in the season. He's just looking after his car, which I don't think we've seen much from him in previous years, and something that I think should be talked about a little bit more.
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely some of the time management he's just been doing is unbelievable. Some of the stints, some that he's bringing medium tires to hard tire stints. The same teams don't like the same stints and hard tires. He's in the same medium tires, and is that the same? Is that what I've just want to ask Adrian Newey, what has he done to that chassis that basically means that that car does not eat tires?
Yeah,
But
that is kind of the thing. It's like when Mercedes were really far ahead, you kind of knew, or at least it was kind of knew why they were so far ahead. It was a really good engine combined with obviously their chassis that made their car so good. When you had maybe Ferrari in 2019, obviously the legality of that engine was a bit iffy. You knew that it was from the engine. 2020 had the DAS system for Mercedes again. But I don't know if maybe I've not been paying attention to the sort of engineering side of it. There's not really been any sort of answer to why the Red Bull is so dominant. There's talk of maybe there's a lot of people saying, oh, they use the DRS in the best way. There's a lot of saying why, but there's not, at least from what I've seen, a lot of how the Red Bull is so good. I mean, I might have just missed all the engineering talk, but I don't know about you guys, but I've not seen much how. There's not really been many concrete answers. Oh, it's this that is making the Red Bull quicker.
I think it's because, from what I've seen, it's just because almost everything about that car is just stronger in general. There's no genuine like one particular area where the car is just maybe slightly weaker compared to that. So, because I keep hearing about the suspension setup and how the car just doesn't dip or dive in the corners or anything like that. Then you got also the Red Bull power unit, which I'll still call a Honda power unit, and how that's just literally been bulletproof as anything, so they don't have to worry about turning the engines down. Then obviously still got aero efficiency, but I think it's just, to be fair, it's probably just the entire package in general. It's just so strong. They can't just pinpoint, oh, like how with Mercedes in 2020 they had that, for example, the DAS, the dual axis steering, that was maybe how pivotal it is. We don't really know, but there's that one definitive feature. Whereas with the Red Bull, with this year's Red Bull, I think it's just the entire package as a whole, plus the driver. Because obviously we're looking at Sergio Perez in that same car, struggling like anything compared to Max, is just as comfortable as he can be right now. He effectively can just have Netflix going on in his steering wheel, and he'll still win the race by like 50 seconds.
I mean, you think maybe you see Perez struggling, and we'll talk about that probably in a second or two. Do you think it is again maybe that Red Bull philosophy of they've got a very set number one and number two structure. When we come to talk about Monza, I'm sure we'll discuss all the debates surrounding Mercedes and Red Bull. Their um, feud sort of sparked up again. Mercedes firing, but they never had this sort of streak with one driver because they always had two drivers competing. They always made a car for both drivers. Whereas maybe you look at Red Bull, and especially as Max has such a unique driving style, that the Red Bull is perhaps maybe being built for Max or built for Max more in mind. And that's why Perez is struggling, and simultaneously that's why Max has gone on such a dominant run.
I'll bring this up again when we get nearer, when we get to Monza and talk about the Mercedes Red Bull feud. But I think I was talking to my dad about it, and he rightly said, look, Mercedes can say that all they want, but they never had the record for the most consecutive wins in a row, regardless of which driver was winning, which Red Bull have. Like, it's all well and good saying that you've got they've got more publicity than you ever did. That's because they're doing things you've never done. I think that's an interesting thing to look at it. I think as well, just the driving style for Max. I think he doesn't need to have the same precision that Checo has. I think he can just run with whatever that car will run quickest in and be able to maximize it. He is one of those gifted drivers that can do that. Whereas Checo might have to sacrifice some lap time speed so that he doesn't bin it in the gravel or whatever. So it's really the fine bits, I think. So I think the massive advantage they've had is that their power unit is so strong at tracks like Monza, they don't have to run the super thin rear wings. And their DRS is so good, it doesn't affect them. So whereas someone like Ferrari, they're so reliant on their power unit being able to keep up in a straight line. But they do have to sacrifice everything through the corners, which is what we've seen at other tracks.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think, Chinmay? Is the Red Bull perhaps built a bit more for Max, or is it just his skill that is at the moment the difference between the two drivers?
I'll probably say the car would definitely be built more for Max because but that's just generally how teams of the proper Hot 1 to hierarchy would generally work anyway. But, last year we'll see McLaren built their car more for Lando, or maybe Williams building their car more for Alex, because obviously being that preferred number one driver, they're the one he's the person who's more reliably going to pick up more points and maybe the victory in Red Bull's case as well. But you can't deny Max's driving capabilities. I mean, he is just another. He's up there already he's potentially maybe up there with the GOAT debate, but already with just the way he's done some of his driving and everything like that as well. I mean, if we'll go back to 2021, Qatar 2021, with Max and Lewis seriously just being 40 seconds ahead of the rest of the field. It's just unreal to see how quick some of these drivers really are.
Yeah, and we'll move on to Max's teammate now, obviously Sergio Perez. We'll also do a quick summary of the Hungarian Grand Prix because for Perez at least, these two races very similar in nature. Hungary, like we said, was, to be honest, really similar to Britain in how it played out. We had Lewis Hamilton on pole this time. I think the first non-Red Bull pole of the season, which lasted for about a few hundred meters before Max took the lead and then went to victory. The McLarens again up there again. Oscar Piastri suffering for something out of his control, getting damage. Who end up finishing? It was fourth or fifth, I think, but Lando taking his second back-to-back podium. Perez did climb to finish third on the grid, but just ahead of Lewis, who was closing on him right at the end. But again, Perez was suffering from a poor quali performance. That streak did end in Belgium, and it looks to have come to an end with the following races. But Will, when you at that point he'd had five consecutive races where he hadn't been in Q3. And when you look at his teammate and the dominance that or the dominance that Max has, that's just, it's not acceptable for in any sort of way for Red Bull. And it's just, I guess, the dominance of the car meant that he could climb back out of the issues that he put himself into on Saturday.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about this a bit later with Nick de Vries losing his seat, but I think you got to the point where you're more concerned about um, Checo losing his than Nick losing his, and I think that spoke volumes considering how badly Nick de Vries was doing. The fact that Checo had this car that is seeming so brilliant and not being able to get out of Q1 for most of the time, or Q2. Yeah, it was concerning, and I think if Red Bull didn't have the same dominance and they were in a title battle with someone like McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, etc., then you would see some movement, I think, in that suit.
Yeah, I mean, Perez, it was just race after race. You saw, oh, who's not in Q3? It's Sergio Perez. And at the start of the season, we looked to maybe the first few races, Perez genuinely on a level with Max. And I remember, was it after Saudi Arabia or the race just after that? There was all that discussion about how Perez was going to be challenging Max for the title. Obviously, that's gone out the window and has dropped into the abyss of hope that the 2023 season would be competitive. But I don't think anyone would have predicted how bad it got for Perez at one point. And you could even bring Belgium into that with the sprint race, and we'll come on to discuss that and maybe whether that should have been a penalty or not. But I mean, it just fell apart during the mid season, and you kind of felt that was the end of the title battle, even if it had probably died a few races before.
And then, to be brutally honest, just knowing how good Max is, I think everyone kind of just saw that the title bout wasn't really going to happen. Even after a couple of races when Checo seemed to have sort of seemed to be closer to Max, but yeah, definitely seeing that mid season drop off especially with qualifying was very very concerning to watch. Considering that your teammate is consistently battling for pole position, and here you are in the more or less the same car, struggling to get out Q2 and even Q1 sometimes. It does raise a lot of questions, but at least he seems to have clawed it back somehow. But at least making it towards battling to at least consistent second row performances at the very least, and at least also he had a really good race pace the entire time as well. So you can't really deny that as much. But again, the fact that he's compromising himself on Sunday already kind of does raise that question about whether he would be staying, or how long he would be staying.
Yeah, and I mean, do you think he will stay next year? Obviously, we have had different updates that will come on to with Zandvoort and Monza that have changed the scope of maybe the AlphaTauri. Will a driver from AlphaTauri be joining the Red Bull outfit, specifically Liam Lawson, who has now jumped into the AlphaTauri for reasons we'll discuss in the next few shows. But do you think Perez stays at Red Bull, especially if they don't have maybe as dominant, the RB20 isn't as dominant as the RB19, and then you are competing with Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, maybe even Aston Martin more regularly? Is that the point where Red Bull start to struggle and they need two drivers, or do you think they'll stick with maybe having Max and Perez, where Max goes on those dominant runs and Perez is just there to pick up just a few extra points they need to win the Constructors' Championship?
I think it's a bit of a tricky one. I think he'll probably start next season in the Red Bull, and if they have competition or if he continues to be lackluster, that's when you'll maybe look to see Liam Lawson coming in. And I wouldn't be shocked at all if Liam Lawson gets that other seat for next year at AlphaTauri. I think that wouldn't be a shock to anyone, especially with it, how we'll get onto it. Like you said, he seems to be doing okay, doing he's not had a lot of time in that car.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be would be Red Bull's preferred a choice to have Liam Lawson, especially since he's sort of like the next in line in terms of graduating from the academy to Formula One. But then again, we'll probably have to see how another driver will probably get onto how he performs for the rest of the season once he returns for said reason. We'll get onto in the next show. But yeah.
Well, we may as well get on to it now because obviously not a lot to say about Red Bull. It's a fairly similar story. Verstappen winning, Perez sort of struggling a little bit. But the Hungarian Grand Prix was the first race where we saw the return of Daniel Ricciardo. Did replace Nick De Vries. Nick De Vries was fired just 9 races into his F1 career. Ricciardo returning for Belgium and Hungary, and putting in some fairly solid performances in that AlphaTauri. Obviously, we have mentioned Liam Lawson, who has now come into the car, but that's a story for another time. So, first off, was it fair for them to fire Nick De Vries after only halfway through his first F1 season and in a car that it's fair to say isn't great considering they've had now more drivers than they've got points?
Just that alone is just so shocking to hear. More drivers and points is just unbelievable. But I mean, in all honesty, I know it's pretty harsh that they literally just booted him after 10 races. But at the end of the day, Nick De Vries is not your typical rookie. He's not 20, 21 years old, coming in straight from the junior ranks. He's 27. He's supposed to be in the prime of his driving career at the moment, and on top of that, he's a decorated race champion. He is a Formula E world champion. He's a Formula Two world champion, Formula Two champion as well, back in 2019, I believe. So he's got that credibility, and Red Bull recruited Nick De Vries as somebody who can literally perform from the get go, and he did exactly the opposite of that. So I think from that perspective, I do think that yes, maybe sacking Nick De Vries was the right choice. I think it may have been a little bit too early. Maybe give him at least until the summer. They could have given him to the summer break at least. But yeah, happy to see Danny. But on the other hand, also happy to see Danny Rick back on the grid, and especially a team that he is very much used to, and hopefully can sort of start bringing some of his prime back. But that is we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to have this conversation, obviously, with what's happened with Daniel Ricciardo and Liam Lawson and everything that has come along with that. But purely on Nick De Vries, I was always skeptical about him being signed in the first place. He never really, obviously, he had that one performance in Monza last year in that Williams where he did score points. Ironically, his only points in F1 came at that race, but Monza for Williams is always their perfect setup. The Williams now are very established as one of the quickest cars in a straight line at the moment. Monza, if it's known for one thing, it is its straight lines, obviously called the Temple of Speed for a reason. I was always skeptical about the De Vries signing, especially him being 28. He is, as you said, old for a rookie. But on the other hand, I feel like if you're going to sign him, you've got to commit to him. I think, especially in that AlphaTauri, though, it's fair to say is probably the worst car on the grid. It's his first season in F1. I don't care how old you are. Coming into F1 is still a difficult thing to do. Any driver that is performing at the top level in their first season is clearly a driver that is special. And even we've seen drivers that in their first seasons, they weren't performing the best. Even in their second, even third seasons, they're not performing the best. You look to the driver winning, Max Verstappen in 2018, he was really struggling at the start of the season and obviously coming into all sorts of collisions. So I think it's harsh to sack Nick de Vries. I get that you get Danny Rick back, and obviously that was the plan until he broke his wrist in Zandvoort. But for me, I wouldn't have sacked Nick. I would have kept them on, and then at the end of the season, perhaps made that decision about who we were going to replace him with, be it Daniel Ricciardo, be it Liam Lawson, or perhaps even someone else. I mean, what do you think, Will?
Yeah, I think he's shown in all of his junior formula that he's not someone that can get in and deliver straight away, but he will eventually give you results. I think it was unfortunate for him, and I think it was a silly move for him to go into a Red Bull team where we know there's a lot of change and how quickly they are to get on people's backs. Although I get it was his only way into Formula One, in which case it is difficult. But I also think that going to Daniel Ricciardo was the wrong choice as well. Because ultimately you've gone from an oldish driver that you don't know what you're going to get yet, that could become a really solid midfield driver, to someone that we've seen as on the decline. Yes, everyone likes him around the paddock, but it wasn't my favourite appointment in the world. I think if you're going to go with someone, you should go with Liam Lawson.
I mean, well, obviously can't discuss it today, but they've gone with Liam Lawson in the end, and acknowledging, I guess, the fact that Liam Lawson is in the car now. He'll probably be in the car for the next two races when we come to discuss them. Do you think that this is essentially now a battle between Ricardo and Lawson for that second AlphaTauri seat? It's almost, well, obviously you wouldn't want a driver to get injured. It has almost worked out in that way, and that it is a really natural experiment to see which driver is potentially better in the car, which driver could potentially pose a better long-term potential for AlphaTauri, and obviously because the two teams are so interlinked, maybe for that second Red Bull seat as well. Obviously, maybe not next year, but into 2025, and probably particularly 2026 with the new regulations coming in.
Yeah, I think it would be an interesting way of kind of comparing the drivers to see what is the best way forward. I think it's a very good test of Liam Lawson to kind of drop him in the middle of the season and see how he does, see what he kind of can produce in this short period of time. So yeah, we'll see what AlphaTauri can do and what they choose to do in the future, because I think that's the most interesting thing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, Chinmay, obviously that is, or it is there for AlphaTauri. There is that experiment. Do you think they do make a decision based off it? Do you think that they give Lawson, so they, I mean, they think at least Helmut Marko has said that he reckons Ricardo might be back in the seat by Qatar time, so that's a few more races for Lawson to perform. Do you think that is essentially their option now? They look to the two performances, see which is the best, and then go for that driver.
Yeah, probably. I think that might be the case as well. I think also another reason for bringing Danny Ricciardo on board is probably to give Yuki Tsunoda a good benchmark, because obviously Danny Ricciardo used to partner Max a few years ago as well, back in 2018, and obviously he is a multiple-time race winner. So maybe in terms of actually, giving Yuki Tsunoda something as a benchmark, if they're trying to eye Yuki Tsunoda to potentially be the next successor to Sergio Perez, to go in the Red Bull, then maybe that's probably another reason they brought him on. But again, I think in a way it'll be good for Red Bull that they got a few races for Lawson to sort of have a look at who's potentially performing better relatively, and probably decide on who gets decide on the AlphaTauri seats and maybe even the spread for second seat for next season, depending on how Sergio performs for the rest of the season.
Yeah, that is probably going to be something. There is a narrative for the next two races that we discuss, and then obviously for the rest of the season as well. The only, maybe even probably only other thing I can think of, especially that comes out of the Hungarian Grand Prix, was the pole sitter wasn't a Red Bull driver. It was Lewis Hamilton taking his first pole since Saudi Arabia 2021. For me, I'm a Hamilton fan. It was nice to see him up the front, even if it didn't last that long into, or didn't last at all into the race. And Mercedes in general, Mercedes in general, both Hamilton and Russell have had a fairly anonymous, or these three races were fairly anonymous for them. They've sort of, you're looking at maybe fourth, fifth. They're the like on every single day they seem to be either the second or the third best team. They're just sort of operating, doing what they do, obviously securing that second place in the championship. And I mean, what do you think that that's just the best that they can do?
Yeah, I think they're doing similar to what they did last year, where they just kind of accepted what they have and just made the most out of it. We saw them last year picking up the odd podium here and there, and I think that's what they're doing this year, just to try and maximise that position in the Constructors' Championship, just to kind of have damage limitations and just hopefully pick up a win if something does go wrong with Max's car. Not that it seems like that will happen anytime soon.
Yeah. And I mean, out of the two drivers, I'd say Lewis probably seemingly more consistent, taking that. Admittedly, it was a fairly lucky third place in Britain. Could have been second if he'd managed to get Norris at the restart. He finished fourth in Hungary, sort of crowded out at the start, but was closing on Perez at the end, and then had a fairly standard race in Belgium, where I think he was either fourth or fifth. I think that shows how mainly anonymous he was. But Lewis in particular has been fairly consistent. And then do you think, again, is that Jimmy just the best that he can do, especially in a season that is so dominated by Red Bull and particularly by Max?
Yeah, I think Lewis Hamilton hasn't really put a foot wrong as such, like majorly. He's extracting as much as he can from the W14, which again doesn't seem to be sort of up there or doesn't seem to be that particularly good especially in a straight line and stuff and things like and mind that stuff. I mean, especially compared to Russell, who seems to be pretty consistent, and at what point did try to sort of consolidate himself as the first driver, even though he was considerably slower than Lewis. Kind of just probably a bit of arrogance coming through right there, but he seems to have mellowed down now. But yeah, no, there's not wrong. I think definitely one of the more solid, consistent drivers we've seen this season, other than Max, obviously.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned Russell there, fifth in Britain, sixth in Hungary, sixth in Belgium. Again, fairly consistent, but quite clearly slower than Lewis. And do you think that that is kind of, you look to 2022, Russell finishing ahead of Lewis in the point standings, but do you think maybe looking back on that, world that there was that maybe luck aspect that George maybe got a bit luckier than Lewis, and perhaps now the luck is sort of equalizing itself, especially with, you'd say, the podium for Hamilton in Britain, but Hamilton, perhaps on the face of it, just having that extra few tenths, at least now they've re-added the side pods to the W14.
I don't know, because I think thinking back to Britain, Lewis was actually behind George until the safety car. I think George was actually the stronger driver, and I think both Mercedes drivers have been equally good and consistent this year. I probably would give the edge to Lewis. I think he has been there when he needs to be, but I think George has been more unlucky than Lewis has been lucky this year. I think back to Australia when he was leading the race and retired, or would have been had it not going for the pit stops under the safety car and whatnot. And then again, Silverstone where he pitted just before. And so I think they've both been good and both been consistent. I think Mercedes will, as we've seen with the new contracts, will both be happy. Will be happy with both their drivers and how they've performed this year in difficult circumstances, considering where they've been in previous years.
Yeah, I mean, Chinmay, again, not much to add. The races have all sort of, as we've said at the start, blurred into one, but Mercedes, they and their drivers have been consistent, and consistency at the moment is probably the best that you can hope for, especially with Red Bull being so dominant. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, especially with that sort of like bit on the pack being so close together behind Red Bull. Consistency is one of the most important factors you need to have, and Mercedes seem to be keeping that up. And especially when you have like teams like McLaren and Ferrari sort of going up and down, they're peaking, and some races where they're just all over the place, or just nowhere on pace. Mercedes seems to be the one team that seems to constantly be up there in terms of competitiveness, which is hats off to them. They've managed to pull that off, but let's see how they do for the rest of the season with any late season developments or which teams decide to call it a day with upgrades this year.
Yeah, and obviously we will see how that goes. We'll bring in the Belgian Grand Prix now, the final of the 3 races that we're going to cover. Again, the race fairly standard. Verstappen did take an engine penalty, decided to spice it up a little bit by taking an engine penalty and starting 6th rather than his customary first on the grid, but was in the lead fairly soon. Charles Leclerc starting on pole, getting jumped by Sergio Perez at the start before they both again got jumped by Verstappen, and it was a Red Bull 1-2 to finish it off before the summer break, with Charles Leclerc in 3rd place, taking, I think, his first podium since the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. As he said, Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso rounding out the top 5. But the week, or at least that weekend, that probably wasn't the most entertaining part of it. And it was the sprint race that really, really performed for the Belgian Grand Prix weekend as a whole. Again, the sprint race showing the complete and utter uselessness of the wet weather tyre. And Will, what is the point of carting around those kilograms of rubber when we'll never use them?
Yeah, it's a bit of a silly one, especially with the amount of them they make. It seems a bit silly at this point. If you don't have a method in place for when they're on, don't take them for now and just say, look, it's not safe. We've seen what can happen, especially at Spa. So it's one of those ones where it's just take the inters, explain to the teams, this is what will happen. If we think it's dangerous, we'll postpone it or we'll delay the start. Otherwise, we'll go out on inters and we'll go from there. Because it's the spray ultimately that's the issue, not so much the grip.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing. They did delay the start. I think probably the rain that was coming down was particularly heavy. I think fair enough delaying the start. But Jimmy, do you think they delayed it for too long? Because you have the delayed start, then you need 10 minutes to warn the teams, and then we get round to the start of the race. They do one lap and they instantly dive into the pits for those. They dive into the pits for those inter tires, taking off the full wets that they were mandated to start on. And again, as we're saying, it seems that the full wets are completely pointless. And if you're going to wait so long to start that eventually it's going to get to inter conditions right as you start, what is the point of either starting on the wet weather tires or having them all together?
Oh, why do they exist? Is the first one. I think we're all trying to figure out why does it exist. But yeah, I don't know. It's a hard one to tell because at the end of the day, the FIA don't want it to be too slippery that there's going to be crashes, and especially where the record that Spa and particularly Rouge and Radion have had the last few years, that it's a track that certainly the FIA are being extra cautious on. And you don't want, and especially how easy it is to spin off in that quarter in particular. For example, you can see why they wanted to be a bit extra careful about starting on full wets to make sure that the engines weren't too slippery because you don't really know until you actually go out on the track and how the drivers feel. But yeah, it is a difficult one to tell. At the end of the day, we don't have all the data. We're not the FIA. They have much more experience at it than we do. But yeah,
Yeah. And once again, obviously, we've been mentioning the weather and the rain came again for I think it was like about the fifth consecutive race weekend. We've just had the Italian Grand Prix weekend, the first weekend that was fully dry since Azerbaijan all the way back in April. And that streak of wet weather, well, it's unprecedented in F1. We obviously had one race completely cancelled by the wet weather, that being Imola, and a number of qualifyings and races and sprint races have been affected by the weather. And is it fair to say that this season maybe has been saved, not saved somewhat, but it's been made perhaps more entertaining than it could have been because of the amount of wet qualifyings, the amount of wet races, the amount of wet sprint races that we've haven't had, and as we all know, that weather spices everything up.
I think it's definitely made qualifying more interesting, but I think it's not necessarily made the races that much better. I think the races themselves, you've kind of known what was going to happen just because of any cars that were put back. You knew were just going to come through. So I think yes, it's improved the season. I think it's improved the spectacle that the new owners are all about, which isn't a bad thing. I think as a fan, I think as fans we can all agree that actually having a wet qualifying is much more exciting. Although it does tend to favour some teams more than others, namely the McLarens and to an extent the Mercedes, because their cars seem to do quite well in the rain, which I think is good because it brings that balance back to it. I think, as we've said enough times, you've got four teams that are pretty evenly balanced across the season now on average, with the Mercedes, the McLaren, the Ferrari, and the Aston Martin. So I think having those battles kind of brought to you by the rain in qualifying is a good thing ultimately.
Yeah. And I mean, Chime, that the rain has been a feature of this season, as along with maybe it's been a running theme. We've had the wet, we've had Verstappen winning, we've had Mercedes and being consistent, Ferrari continuing to sort of put a ball into a magic wheel, and whatever strategy they get out of that will be the one they get for today. But
Plan Z.
Plan Z, Plan A2, or I don't know, they probably make a load of them, but has the rain, do you think, improved the season? Has it maybe taken away from some of the points where we might have wanted a dry race or a dry qualifying or something like that?
I would probably say the Raiders probably saved the season a bit more, especially considering, just that Dominus Max Verstappen just ruins a lot of things about the season. Having the rain sort of being that point where it can actually mix up the grid a little bit, favoring some teams more than others when they're usually on the back foot in qualifying kind of helps as well. But yeah, no, I think generally speaking, it's been fine. The rain's just been there. Hasn't done anything too bad in terms of ruining. There's not been Spa 2021s or anything that as drastic as that. So I think
Yeah.
I would say pretty much has been a good thing so far.
Well, I mean, that's probably what I'd say for the rain as well, in that it seems to have always come, and then it's never really thrown up much chaos in a way. Probably the most chaotic we've had is, again, we'll come on to it next time with the Dutch Grand Prix and all that rain that came along. You look back to maybe the Austrian sprint race as well, almost that perfect. Is it better to stay on the inters or is it better to go to the dry tires? And maybe with this Belgian sprint as well was one of the most entertaining wet wet events that we did have. Piastri, as we mentioned so far, bringing up his numbers by taking the lead of the sprint race, holding it for a few laps before, as ever, Max Verstappen was inevitable and then overtook him. But other than that, it was a fairly entertaining race. We had Alonso making an uncharacteristic error, and probably the biggest talking point, the Perez Hamilton collision. All right, I'm obviously ever so slightly biased when it comes to these sorts of things. So we'll throw it to the resident Ferrari fan in in the podcast. And he'll provide us with a perfectly unbiased opinion that I may or may not agree with, depending on what it is.
I mean, to be honest, it's been so long ago, I can't entirely remember what happened.
So it was at the final corner before the Blanchimont Straight, and I think Perez had run wide or something, or it might have just been Lewis challenging Perez
Oh,
on
yes, yeah,
tyres,
I think
and then he goes up
Lewis
the
almost came
inside.
across. Yeah, I think it was a racing incident. I think it was one of those. It's one of those corners that you carry so much speed through that you don't want to back out if you're on the outside, and it's hard to leave that room on the inside when you are coming through. So I think it's one of those ones where neither driver is at fault, but I think if you're on the inside, you do need to leave that room. That is ultimately what the rules are, regardless of who's in front, who's behind. You need to make sure there's room on the outside for that driver.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think, Chinmay?
I'm still trying to remember the incident because it's so long ago. I actually can't remember it. What exactly happened? But
Yeah, it was just Hamilton up the
yeah,
inside, sort of hits the curb a little bit and does his seemingly traditional at this point contact with the right hand side of a Red Bull that he's sort of made a trademark of.
no, I don't think. I think it was just an incident. Like, well, so at that corner, you're just carrying so much speed, and it's so difficult to leave that space. It is a hard one to tell whether obviously it wasn't intentional, but yeah, I think at the end of the day, it just happened.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm coming at it with a bit of a biased perspective, but for me it was more of a racing incident in that, as we said, it's not a corner you traditionally try and overtake at. It's not one where you're thinking, oh, that's an overtaking opportunity. And you maybe Perez is caught out by that, maybe Lewis is caught out by the run he's got. But one of those, I think, it's maybe one of those where you almost look at the consequence of the collision and that's why he's got the 5 second time penalty rather than what has actually happened. Obviously, Perez drops down the order and then eventually retires. And again, I've never been a big fan of consequences being used to identify a penalty. So that that is probably what I'd say. I think that it is a race, or it was a racing incident for me. But then
Um,
obviously the 5 second penalty is given, it drops him down the field, and I guess it gets a Pierre Gasly sprint race podium, so could be worse.
I mean, I've just rewatched it. I think as as an unbiased person, I think it is a racing incident, but I still think Lewis is more at fault. I think there's a lot of room on the inside for him to still make that move. And yes, he'd have to compromise his exit at maybe the next turn, maybe lose some speed. But I think if you're going to make that move, you have to face that you might have to do that. You have to make it stick without basically taking whatever line you want through the corner. You have to take whatever line is given to you. I think if you can't do it that way, then you have to maybe think about whether the move should be made and think, yes, it is a racing incident, but on Inter's tyres or wet tyres and in slippery conditions, it would have been very easy for Lewis, as he's already drifting over, just to completely understeer just straight into the side of him, as we've seen him do a few times.
Yeah. It's a difficult one to judge. I think that's why there was so much debate about it. I mean, Chime, have you got any final thoughts on the incident? Probably one of the last things that we'll end up talking about.
Nah, I don't think so. I think I'll just end up repeating what Will just said now. But yeah, no, I think just racing incident at the end of the day, it happened. May all move on, and yeah.
Yeah. So that probably brings us to the end of the three races. We'll maybe finish it off quickly. We'll look at the winners and overall winners and losers of the triple header. Whether we'll look at anyone we've maybe missed out on. I'll start. Obviously, I'd say a winner, Max Verstappen, definitely with those three race wins. Obviously, he would end up being a winner. I've gone for the easy one. My probably loser again, Nick De Vries, being fired from an F1 race or F1 team isn't the best thing that you can do. I mean, have you guys got any ones that we might not have covered that we should have a quick talk about for your winners and losers?
Alpine had a good few races. I think they looked not necessarily a contender for like the podiums, but I think they looked more consistent. They looked more organised, and obviously Otmar Safnauer was removed after Belgium, which was like quite eventful to release that on Friday morning or Saturday morning, whenever it was.
I thought he left halfway through. I thought he was like, I'm not sticking around for the Belgian Grand Prix. I know you say Alpine were a winner, but as far as I can recall, didn't they have a double DNF in Britain and Hungary?
Yes, they're an absolute stinker.
I think by winner they got rid of Otmar Safnauer was the main point.
Yeah, that is true. And to be fair to them, oh yeah, there you go.
I think to have someone that can manage two drivers is going to be helpful, whoever that may be. So I think they seem to be less angry at each other since he's left. Maybe he just has that effect on people.
Yeah, and I think to be fair to them, the double DNF in Hungary wasn't really their fault. Like it was obviously it's Zhou went Bottas bowling after his P5 in qualifying, which is a really good performance from him. It kind of went all pear-shaped. Maybe another winner that we've forgotten to mention, Alex Albon, who has had some very good performances um, over those two or over these three races in a Williams that looks like it's coming good. They might get their best constructors performance for the past few years. Obviously, this is single-handedly being carried by Alex Albon, but even Logan Sargent potentially looking better. Like Albon's a really good driver, I think. It's clear to see, but Sargent potentially looking a bit better. Again, it's difficult coming in to a new team in your rookie season. And I'm still again I've got Sargent in the same boat as Albon, but Albon in particular, Chinmay, has been putting in some really good performances and Williams look almost on their way to securing that P6.
Yeah, no, definitely. Alex has definitely put a shift on, and there's no denying that he has been one of the strongest performance in the last few races. Williams. I'm just looking at how many, they've got 21 points now. Obviously, all of which have been done by Alex. Versus sixth is probably too far of a shout because sixth versus Alpine. I think they will eventually pick up more points anyway.
Yeah, I think I meant seventh. But
yeah, but
best of the bottom tier. It's looking good for them.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely been a very, very good few months for James Vowles. Has come in. He's definitely turning that team around very slowly. You don't really see that effect. Logan Sargent perhaps was pretty unlucky. Was it in Silverstone when he was 11th? But yeah, again, he's slowly building up as well. I think he's definitely got, of the rookies, he's definitely got the biggest curve still to go. He's definitely got potential. He just needs to show up on a Sunday now, get some points in the bag in order to, if he is going to retain his seat for next year as well. but I don't see him being booted at the moment.
No,
But
he seems fine. And I guess one final team we'll talk about, and I'll let Will decide if they're a winner or a loser, and that is Ferrari over these three races. Again, not never really had a standout performance. Maybe the Leclerc P3 in Belgium, but they were never really like falling away like they
No.
normally did
Uh,
this time last
I,
season.
I think I would describe them more as losers. I think the first few races just weren't good for them. I think it just highlighted how circuit limited that car is. And I think both the drivers had said by this point just how excited they are to move, similar to the Mercedes drivers last year, about how excited they are to get away from it just because it is so much of a handful. I think it's still impressive that they're getting some of these results in places like Spa, and we'll come to talk again Monza, but I think it wasn't a good three races for them.
Yeah. And obviously, we will come on to talk about some races that had better performances, like you said, with Monza for Ferrari. But at the moment, Ferrari firmly in the losers bracket. That's been all three of the races that we have done. But while we didn't make shows for each of the races individually, we did do predictions for each of the races individually. And Chime, I think do you have them? Do you have them up at the moment? Oh,
I do have them. I was just putting them up again. I'm trying to figure out what was the last thing we did again.
so the
So,
last one we did was Austria. So actually
uh,
we need to do the Austrian predictions as well.
okay, yeah, okay,
Oh
now
no,
I see the one. So, okay, well, I have to go back into Austria.
oh no, no,
So,
sorry, we don't need to do the Austrian predictions. What am I on about? We just need to do
I
the
think the
three.
last
we
thing
need
we
to do the
did
results
was,
at least.
when I predicted them for Chinmay.
No, you did Silverstone.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, so we need to look at the. This is very professional. We need to look at the Silverstone predictions, the Belgian predictions, and the Hungary predictions. Just those three sets. We have done the Austrian predictions when we did our Austria show.
Yeah. So it was 47-45 to me. So pretty close. And yes, so obviously I wasn't there when we did the Austria show, so Will Biddle's deputized for me in this case. So Will and Will predicted, Will Kingswood.
This is not confusing anymore.
No, this is definitely not confusing at all. So Will Kingswood did Leclerc, Perez, Norris prediction, and then you said two drivers score points. Three drivers, at least three drivers did a three stop, and Max leads less than 3 laps. We can definitely discount the 3 pointer.
Yeah.
uh, did how many was? I think most people did a two stop of that race anyway. I
So
believe
this was for Britain,
Silverstone.
wasn't it?
Yeah,
Yes, I think most drivers they did a two stopper. I think that was the prevailing strategy of the day.
yeah. And obviously, and both Ferraris finished. And then for Will Biddles, who did this fight, he did a. I just realized I've been doing this wrong way around. So I just said Will Biddles predictions, which has gone well. So no, so the Leclerc Paris Norris was actually Will Biddles predictions, but Will Kingswood predicted Verstappen, Sainz, Hamilton. Both Ferraris finished in the top 10, which they did. 3+ DNFs, which there were exactly 3, and there will be a 2x2 top 8 in quali. So each team, but which that didn't happen. So at the end of that, it ended up being 54-49 to Will.
Oh, have I taken a commanding lead? Will,
Yes.
you've really not carried that for Jim, mate.
But oh well, it is what it is. And then what we did, we predicted Hungary next. um, so I predicted a Verstappen, Russell, Perez, um, And then my 3-pointers were Alonso qualifies in the top 5, which didn't happen. Daniel Ricciardo beat Tsunoda in the race, which did happen. And no Ferrari engine cars in the points, which definitely didn't happen because I know it was one Ferrari. There was one Ferrari and 2 Alphas. Was it double Ferrari?
Yeah, double
points?
Ferrari.
I can't remember.
Seventh and 8th.
Oh, fair. And then
that's about 6 points, is it?
Something like that. I counted. It was 8 points actually.
Ooh.
Because I think it was Verstappen was first, Perez was third.
Oh yeah, Perez was third.
And then you predicted, Will Kingswood predicted Hamilton, Alonso, Norris. Perez won the Q3, which he did. Norris on the podium, which he was second. And the top 4 are 4 different teams, but first and third were Red Bull, so.
That was 4 points, I think.
Yes, so I closed the gap that weekend, 58-57 to Will.
Oh.
And then we move on to Spa-Francorchamps. So I predicted Norris, Perez, Leclerc.
Norris, Perez, Leclerc.
Which I think I got my second and third actually bang on there.
Yeah, actually, I don't know why I'm making fun of that. That's really good.
I know, it looks so bad. And there's, oh wait, I actually nailed it with Perez and Leclerc. No, and then my 1-pointer, for some reason, I put Verstappen doesn't win one of either the sprint or the normal race for some stupid reason. I put that as my 1-pointer.
Yeah.
Then I put one of the first 3 rows as locked up by a team in I think was it sprint quali.
The sprint quali, we had
yes.
one of the first 3 rows. You were actually right. Ferrari were third and fourth in the second row of the grid.
Yeah. And then I said Williams outscores McLaren and Aston Martin during the weekend, which Williams scored exactly 0 points.
You managed to pick the one race Williams weren't good, decent at.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we'll go back onto you, Will, for last and definitely not least. You did Verstappen, Hamilton, Piastri.
You know what? Had Piastri not been taken out by Sainz, it could have happened. So I'm taking solace from that, even though it didn't.
Yeah. And then you said there was a crazy starting/finishing grid in one of the sessions.
All right. The sprint. It was Verstappen, Piastri, Gasly. I feel like.
Yeah, I'll give you that. I'll give you that.
No, we'll go to our independent adjudicator, Will Biddles. We'll see what he thinks. Whether does that count as a crazy finishing grid?
I think it does, especially when you look at the performance of the McLaren that weekend. It just wasn't very good at all.
Yeah, so it was Verstappen, Piastri, Gasly, Sainz, Leclerc, Norris, Hamilton, Russell, Ocon, Ricciardo. I think that counts.
Yeah, it does count.
Especially with Ricciardo.
Yeah, then your 2-pointer was Verstappen was P1 by the start of lap 7 in the race. I think he actually went to double digits.
Yeah, I think he got to about lap 14, I think. 14 or 15.
And then you said there'll be at least 16 Fs in the race, which did not happen. I think it was about 2.
There were 2. Oh no, that's the sprint. Oh no, is that the race? No, it's the sprint. There were still 2. Yeah, it was Piastri and Sainz.
So that means I snatched the lead with 65-62, heading into, well, it's going to be Singapore now because we didn't make any for Zandvoort and Monza.
Yeah.
But we'll make Singapore in the next show anyway.
Yeah,
we'll actually preview it.
Yeah, we'll make some Singapore predictions when we come onto it. Well, obviously that was a bit of a back and forth battle between us two. Chinmay coming into it with the lead. I came back, and then Chinmay exiting it with the lead again. And one thing I have to say is you really messed up with your predictions for Silverstone. What came over you? Leclerc P1?
Well, I don't know. I was in a good mood. I thought Ferrari would do well. What can I say? Just be grateful I don't do it every week for Chinmay.
I'd be winning by miles. No, but I'd say some good predictions in there, some ones that weren't as terrible as maybe they were on paper. As we've been saying, next show we'll be looking, or the next few shows we'll be looking at Zandvoort and Monza, two races that, yeah, fairly good talking points. Probably Zandvoort in particular, obviously, with all the carnage that unfolded during the wet weather, but Monza as well. The potential Ferrari battle that could have come a cropper, but they managed to survive out of it. Obviously, Verstappen taking his 10th win in a row as well. Thank you again to Chinmay and Will for discussing these three races with me. We're looking forward to getting back to doing this, and obviously, when we get back to university for the new year, we'll have these in crystal clear audio live on Raw 12:51 a.m. Anything you guys want to add for the final few seconds of the show?
Uh, No, not really. I'm just hoping we've got some good bangers coming up for the end of the year. That's all.
Yeah, and obviously we'll be able to watch them live with the Warwick F1 Society, won't we?
Yes, we will be back very, very soon, hopefully at the Clarendon. I think I'm just actually let me look at the calendar now. The first race we'll be able to do is not until the 8th of October,
So,
because it'll be
It will be.
Qatar then.
Oh,
Our,
yeah.
our
So
first
it's
our
pretty
first
fun.
race at the Society of all races.
what do you mean? We will be getting up at 5 a.m. to watch Japan in a pub.
Oh, definitely. Wait, no, that is the weekend before Freshers Week anyway.
Yeah, I don't think I'm getting anywhere out of bed to watch
Yeah.
Japan, and knowing this season Japan will be the one race that we get that will actually be dry when that's normally the wet one. Verstappen might have won the title by then.
That's a terrifying thought.
Well, we'll come back. We'll talk about all of that again. Thank you to Will. Thank you to Chinmay, and I've been Will, obviously, as well. We'll be back next week talking Monza and Zandvoort, but thank you for listening.
Nice.